If you were to ask anyone close to me, what is the one word that describes Johanna over the course of her entire life, they would probably tell you something along the lines of curious. Since I was little, I've had this insane curiosity about the world around me, and as you can probably tell from the picture, I wasn't afraid to get my hands dirty to figure it all out. Whether it was worms, or clock radios, or chemical reactions, I wanted to see how all of the pieces fit together to make up something bigger than themselves. And while this curiosity usually helped me learn more about the world around me, there were times that it got me in a bit of trouble. For example, when I was about a year old, there was a day that my mother was making lunch in the kitchen when the phone rang. And my mother didn't think much of leaving me alone in the kitchen, because up until that point, I hadn't been that ornery of a child. Keywords being up until that point. Well, she left the kitchen, and she answered the phone, and about a minute into her phone conversation, she heard this earth-shattering boom echo throughout the house that originated, you guessed it, from the kitchen. So she ran back inside, and she found me sitting on top of our kitchen refrigerator with pieces of a glass barometer sticking out of my mouth, because apparently in the time that she'd been gone, I'd found a way to scale the refrigerator, grab the glass barometer just outside my reach, and bite it. Needless to say, that experiment in curiosity was a little more hands-on than my parents probably would have hoped for, but that curiosity is also what led me to the world of science. Now, when I was in middle school, I had an experience in the world of science that changed my life completely. The high school science teacher at the time knew that I was interested in science and suggested that I attend a university-sponsored science camp. That summer, I attended a camp about climate change and alternative energy sources, and I loved it. This picture is not from that camp. It's from a camp that I attended a couple years after the original one about sustainability. But to give you an idea of how engrossed in the information I was, in every picture I can find of myself from that original camp, I'm either looking away from the camera, or it's obvious that I don't understand someone's taking my picture in the first place because I'm making some horribly awkward face. But the fact of the matter is, I was so into what they were talking about that I didn't even realize there was someone there to take my picture in the first place. Anyway, I came back from that original camp, and I wanted to tell everyone else around me about what I'd learned about climate change. But when I tried to have a conversation with them, they just weren't that interested. Now, to me, this was entirely confusing, because I just spent the past 2 weeks at camp learning about how climate change is one of the few issues that has the ability to impact everyone on the planet through wildfires and drought and extreme storms and extinction of species, and yet no one seemed that worried. I began to question why this was the case, that so many people could seemingly not care about something that could change their lives completely. And it wasn't until I began working in my college writing center that I began to find an answer to this question. Now, to give you a better idea about what our college writing center does on campus, the Writing, Reading, and Speaking Lab is a tool for students to use to improve their writing, reading, and speaking abilities, although most who use it to improve their writing ability. While all of the consultants are trained to help a variety of student needs, my particular specialty as an environmental science major is to help students with their lab reports. Over the course of the year, many first-year science majors frequent the Writing Center for help with their lab reports, because the structure of writing a lab report is often very different from the structure of any other kind of literature they've had to compose in the past. While I'll comment on this structure later on in my speech, one of the first things that students needed in order to draft a strong lab report was to have strong background information. So, when the first-year science majors would come into the Writing Center for help with their lab reports, I would address this information with some variation of 2 questions. What is this report about? And how does it pertain to your own research? Now, this is where I began to notice a startling trend. To answer the first question, the students would usually recite a couple of sentences from the introduction without really being able to paraphrase the information or put it in their own words. And to answer the second question, they often didn't no. Now, to me, as both a writing consultant and a scientist, this was a huge red flag. It wasn't that the students coming into the Writing Center were not interested in science. For most of them, it's what they were majoring in. And it wasn't that they couldn't grasp the concepts being discussed in the article. It was, as I found out through more questions, that they didn't know how to read it. Now, I know what some of you are probably thinking. The statement I just made sounds ridiculous. How can a science student not know how to read scientific writing? But the fact of the matter is, scientific writing often includes several aspects that make it hard for anyone without much experience in science writing to understand it. Scientific literature often includes specific jargon to reference terms that are imperative to understanding the rest of the piece. Not only this, it is often devoid of imagery or immersive language and emphasizes precise details about the methods of research conducted, which can leave readers confused about what they should take away from the overall literature. Finally, while the literature often includes a section at the end where it asks questions of the reader more than what the literature itself can explain, it doesn't really offer a way for the reader to question other aspects of the literature as they're reading it. That being said, each of these aforementioned aspects is absolutely crucial to maintaining the integrity of scientific writing. The specific jargon referenced is less considered jargon and is more considered accurate scientific terminology. Imagery and immersive language are not needed to adequately convey the methods of research used, and they often get in the way of the reader understanding those methods if they aren't explained in as plain a way as possible. And as far as outside questions are concerned, these can be answered through citations of past literature found throughout the piece, or by the reader looking up more information that corresponds to the question that the reader actually has. Because it's not considered the job of the researcher writing the report to adequately explain all aspects of the concepts that they're exploring. Rather, it's considered their job to explain their own research, so that others could replicate this research or come to their own conclusions about their findings. But how then are those without much experience in scientific writing supposed to get anything out of it? If the only means to understanding science are written like this, how is anyone without a background in science supposed to read it and understand what has the ability to impact their lives? And furthermore, if only a tiny subsect of the population can actually read and fully understand this research, then how can we expect our society to make educated decisions about science that they quite frankly don't understand? It suddenly became far more clear to me how people cannot care about climate change. If the majority of the research published about climate change was published like this, the fact of the matter is, a majority of our population is not scientists. And those who weren't would have next to no way of reading that information and taking away that climate change is a serious problem. The overall problem, I would argue, has two main aspects. First, those without much experience in scientific writing don't know how to read and understand it. And those with more experience in scientific writing don't have much experience in communicating with those beyond their peers in a way that resonates with the rest of society. The solution to this problem, therefore, also has two main components. First, as a society, we must learn how to read like a scientist. To accomplish this, as the old saying goes, practice makes perfect. As was the case for the first-year scientists who came into the Writing Center, most simply hadn't had that much experience in reading scientific literature. And while they would get more experience simply through repetition over the course of their college career, they needed a way to get a foothold on the information enough that they could understand their literature and write their own lab report. So, The best way that I found to help them get this understanding was to give them the quick and dirty explanation of a lab report, which included examples that they may have had more experience with in their day-to-day lives that corresponded to the different sections of a lab report. A lab report is usually comprised of 5 main sections: an abstract, an introduction, a materials and methods section, a results section, and a discussion section. The abstract provides a basic overview of the rest of the study and usually highlights the introduction and the discussion sections. You could compare this to the cover of a novel. It gives you enough information to get you interested in the rest of the story, but in order to really understand it, you actually have to read the book. The introduction section provides background information about what the researcher is aiming to answer with their study and may provide the actual question that the researcher looks at throughout their experiment. You could compare this to the title sequence of Star Wars. It sets the stage for the rest of the story and gets the viewer caught up on the information that they need to understand the rest of the story, as is articulated through "a long time ago in a galaxy far, far away." The materials and methods section provides all of the materials and methods that the researcher used in order to complete their experiment. You could compare this to a recipe in a cookbook. If you want to, say, bake a cake correctly, you first must gather all the necessary ingredients and perform the steps in the right order to come up with a delicious and accurate product. The results section of a lab report includes all of the data obtained throughout the lab report and usually includes most of the charts and graphs needed to understand this information. While this section provides all of the data obtained throughout the lab report, it does not provide any interpretation of this data, which makes it a little bit harder to explain this to students who don't have much experience in scientific literature. What I found works best is to explain this like the output of a calculator. Say you enter 2 plus 2 into a calculator and you press the equals button. It will give you your answer, 4, but it won't necessarily tell you why the answer is 4. For that, you have to go to the discussion section. The discussion section, as previously mentioned, provides all interpretation of the data obtained throughout the rest of the piece. And it usually provides any sources of error that the researchers encountered throughout their study and poses further questions than what the study itself can answer. You could compare this to the epilogue of a book. It sums up all the rest of the information found throughout the study and answers any unanswered questions found by the researchers that weren't previously explained. It also provides further questions than what the study itself can answer and may set up the story for a sequel. As you can see, the different sections of a lab report parallel the many different types of literature that people may have had more experience with in their day-to-day lives. And while having this understanding of scientific literature is important, it is only half of the solution when it comes to understanding science. It is not right that Bill Nye is one of the only faces of science available on our news media today. Now, don't get me wrong, I respect Bill Nye to the utmost degree. I watched his program growing up like most of the rest of my generation, and I loved it. But the fact of the matter is, he is not, nor could he be, the most educated person on all aspects of science. And the fact that more of those researchers who are directly involved in climate science aren't out there talking about their findings holds all of us back from a deeper understanding about their research. When we, as scientists, let someone else talk about our research, we forfeit our narrative to people who may or may not have the background in the particular area of science that they're discussing that we do. As a scientific community, we need to do better about explaining our information in a way that is beyond the way we discuss it with our peers. This means that while we still publish as we have in the past in scholarly journals, we also publish in more public-friendly revenues of communication that not only inform others about our research, but get them excited about our research. We need to write to grab their attention. We need to answer their questions. We need the world to see us and see us for what we are. People just like them. And when we hide behind the facade of a lab report, we put up a wall between ourselves and those who we desperately need to hear us. We simply cannot continue to do this if we want the world to care about our research in subjects like climate change. All in all, our only limits are those that we set for ourselves. If we hold ourselves back from reaching out and sharing our knowledge, we hold everyone else back with us as well. Our future, then, is determinant on whether or not we can push past these limitations. Our future depends on how well we can have a conversation about what matters most. Thank you.